In today's Essential Task, we are going to discuss the major diagnostic category of personality disorders. I recommend vertical for today's concept map, as you can see here. This is definitely a vertically aligned concept map. We'll be talking about the broad term personality disorders and then talk about three separate columns labeled cluster A, B, and C. This is one of the longer concept maps in this unit. There are quite a few different personality disorders, which we're going to be talking about today. So we'll proceed into the concept map after just a moment. Starting all the way at the top, as we typically do, we will define personality disorders. The term personality was the name of a whole unit back earlier this year. When we talked about personality, we talked about the idea of categorizing somebody based on these unchanging and long-lasting behavioral patterns. Well, personality disorders are going to take the name of just personality itself and then put it into the context of a psychological disorder, where we're going to be looking at disorders that are characterized by unchanging and long-lasting behavioral patterns, specifically those that impair whether it's social or personal functioning. That last portion of the definition is applicable to all of the disorders from this entire unit. We've made points where disorders can affect things like social interactions, occupation, education, academic, hygiene, etc. Well, today we'll talk about how personality, and specifically these unchanging and long-lasting behavioral patterns, can relate to that impairment. To be noted, the DSM-5 categorizes personality disorders into three separate clusters. It's unlikely that the College Board would require you to know that in much depth, but the three columns that you're about to see are going to be structured into cluster A, B, and C, simply because that's how the DSM structures them. So there is a rhyme or reason or logic to the categorization here of these three columns, but nevertheless, they all fall under the category broadly of personality disorders. We're going to start on the left side, as we always do, talking about cluster A. The disorders that fit the cluster A column, if we were to group them together, would fall into this odd or eccentric behavior categorization. So regardless if we talk about schizoid personality disorder, which we're about to talk about, or schizotypal, each of the disorders in this category have odd or eccentric behavior attached to their symptoms. I should note, I just have the word schizoid written out. On the AP exam, on our material, this would say schizoid personality disorder. So you would actually see the words personality disorder attached to the end of each of these names. Because there's something like 9 disorders that we're going to talk about today, I'll even zoom out to preview this. I have left off the personality disorder, so you don't have to copy it down 9 times. But do note that each of the names, schizoid, schizotypal, paranoid, and so on, would have the words personality disorder attached to the end. We'll start though with schizoid personality disorder. This is characterized by a behavioral pattern that shows that there is no interest or desire to interact with other people. What's important here is this has nothing to do with anxiety. If you think back to our anxiety disorders, we talked about a few disorders that could relate to that behavioral pattern. Social anxiety disorder, anxiety particularly talking to strangers and in those social interactions. To a lesser extent, agoraphobia, anxiety in social situations, particularly social situations that are really crowded. We have a difficult time feeling like you can escape or not. Schizoid personality disorder is very different, because instead we're going to be talking about an individual who does not feel anxiety talking to strangers or going into public. They simply voluntarily withdraw and have limited emotional expression coupled with that voluntary social withdrawal. And it's really important that there's no anxiety here. So you might ask somebody on a Friday night why they choose to stay home, and there could be several answers. It could be, I feel anxious talking to strangers, social anxiety disorder. I feel anxious in crowded places, I'd rather not go to a party, agoraphobia. Or I simply have no interest in human interaction beyond the absolute bare necessities. That might be apparent for schizoid personality disorder. When I look at the zoid at the end of schizoid, I think of the word void, and I think of the idea of being void of friends, but it's particularly voluntarily void of friends. So that double V there to me is useful. Voluntarily void of friends. The next is what we call schizotypal personality disorder, which is characterized by odd or eccentric beliefs or behaviors. Plenty of people believe in, whether it's conspiracy theories or even believe in UFOs per se. I'm not saying that if you believe in UFOs, that that's a byproduct of schizotypal personality disorder. But when you put all of the things together, when you're looking for schizotypal personality disorder, what we're going to be looking for is interpersonal awkwardness. So somewhat unusual, maybe speech patterns or interactions, interpersonal reactions, which is person to person, can sometimes lead to a little bit of social isolation. Superstitions. I mean, really over-the-top superstitions. Sometimes eccentric appearance, and that can sometimes be reflected by dress. For example, it's not typical, and it would be unusual and atypical to dress up in, let's say, a clown outfit and not actually be a clown. Just make that a normal byproduct of your wardrobe. And that might be a eccentric belief or behavior that's just atypical relative to everyone else. Sometimes odd speech patterns. If you're familiar with Willy Wonka, and particularly the more recent Willy Wonka, I think that's a fantastic portrayal of odd or eccentric beliefs with obviously eccentric dress. If you're familiar with Willy Wonka, definitely eccentric or odd speech patterns, a little bit of social awkwardness, certainly social isolation. If you were to watch the clip here at the bottom, it's only about a minute long, but I think it does a good portrayal of what this would look like in person. Now, granted, it's in Hollywood, but I think nevertheless, the portrayal in that movie is pretty good. It also gives us a mnemonic that when I look at the word schizotypal, I see the T and the Y in typal, and I think of the very famous Willy Wonka candy, Laffy Taffy, which starts with a T and ends with a Y. So whenever I look at schizotypal, to me it says schizo taffy, and then I connect with Willy Wonka, and I think about the dress and the speech patterns and a little bit of that social awkwardness or even isolation. The last one in cluster A is paranoid personality disorder, and it actually is just what it sounds like. It's an individual who exhibits immense levels of paranoia, often meaning that they have a difficult time trusting other people. They question the motives of other people, constantly curious of, is this person being truthful and honest with me? Is this person trying to take advantage of me? Is my boss trying to take advantage of me? My friends and family trying to take advantage of me? And I want to make it clear that the paranoia is not a byproduct of anxiety. If we go back a few essential tasks ago, we would have talked about generalized anxiety disorder, and you might see examples of paranoia, worrying if, for example, you're going to have a flat tire in the morning, worrying about if something incredibly unlikely is going to happen to you financially, and there be that what appears like paranoia. But the paranoia with paranoid personality disorder is not linked to anxiety. If you go to a patient with generalized anxiety disorder, that fear of financial collapse or having a flat tire would be coupled with anxiety. That's not necessarily the case here. We're just talking about a consistent behavioral pattern of questioning the motives of those around you, worrying if people are going to take advantage of you. And it doesn't have to be coupled there with anxiety. Proceeding to cluster B, we're going to be talking about a series of disorders. There are 4 actually that fit this cluster of dramatic or impulsive behavior. So each of the disorders that we're going to talk about in some capacity exhibit that impulsive behavior or dramatic behavior. The first is what's called narcissistic personality disorder. This might be a term that you've heard prior to taking this class. Narcissistic personality disorder can be reflected in a few different ways. The first is grandiose thinking. So believing that you've succeeded in a way that is unimaginable, that is unmatched, that your accomplishments are simply beyond parallel, that you simply have achieved and accomplished more than anybody else could even remotely consider. And oftentimes that's coupled with seeking excessive admiration. So you build up your accomplishments and expect people to proclaim that you are the greatest, to look at your accomplishments that you've sort of put on this pedestal and expect acclaim and expect recognition and expect, in some cases, awards for it. And then also this lack of empathy. So when we talk about the term empathy, we're talking about the ability to sort of get into somebody else's shoes, to understand what they're experiencing. And individuals that exhibit narcissistic personality disorder often have a very difficult time with that empathy. They have a tough time looking at somebody else's situation or their life and understanding what it is they're going through. And then, of course, that's often coupled with building up their own achievements and accomplishments, and then even seeking that excessive admiration from someone. So when we look at narcissistic personality disorder, we might, for example, see somebody who walks into a restaurant and expects to be seated right away. And then they're told, well, I'm sorry, there's a line, you have to wait, it's 15 minutes. And then, the individual might say, well, why is it that I need to wait? And then person might be told, well, there are 5 people in front of you. You simply can't jump the line. And a person that's exhibiting narcissistic personality disorder might have this disconnect between, well, these 5 individuals have been here before me. Should I understand their position, or should I build up myself as being this grandiose high achiever who is worthy of cutting the line? Well, that's something that we would look for with narcissistic personality disorder. Not to be confused, though, with histrionic personality disorder. So it's very easy to confuse narcissistic personality disorder from histrionic personality disorder if you've never been told the difference. Histrionic personality disorder is when an individual is excessively dramatic, in some cases excessively emotional, even though given the context that might be out of place, and honestly in some cases might even be excessively emotional in a way that's not authentic, particularly to be the center of attention. And that last part is key. That's why I've highlighted it there in yellow. To an untrained eye, somebody who's exhibiting the symptoms of histrionic personality disorder might be labeled narcissistic, but there's a very important and clear discrepancy between those two. If somebody, for example, in a group setting ensures that they are the center of attention, whether that's making sure they make comments that they know are going to elicit a response, or in some cases, and this is often the way the College Board refers to it, as being overly flirtatious to everybody in that area, so that they're the center of attention regardless. Those are the types of things that you would look for with histrionic personality disorder. And that doesn't necessarily have to be coupled with this grandiose, self-inflated view of themselves, which is what we're looking for with narcissistic personality disorder. So the over-the-top behavior might be similar. The propensity for drama might be similar, but they're two very different disorders, and we need to categorize them appropriately. With histrionic personality disorder, somebody might make comments or do behaviors that they know is going to garner the attention of everybody around them, but that's not necessarily seeking admiration. Now, if somebody makes comments about, I've just achieved the greatest thing possible, nobody could ever reach my level, I am the most accomplished, most wealthy, most successful person on earth, well, that's more narcissistic. That person's not necessarily trying to be the center of attention. They're just trying to get the admiration of their peers. Somebody that's exhibiting histrionic personality disorder doesn't need to make those grandiose statements, but they could nevertheless do something like be overly flirtatious, as I mentioned, or simply make offhanded comments that they know are going to elicit responses from those around them, simply to be the center of attention. I want you to watch the first 4 minutes of this clip down here. This clip does a really fantastic job of giving you a Hollywood portrayal of histrionic personality disorder. I think it does a really fantastic job of showing you what I mean by wanting to be the center of attention without that grandiose seeking of admiration. Continuing onward, we have antisocial personality disorder, and I need to make this clear. I even included it in the definition. If you take an educated guess what this term is, or if someone in the general population were to do that, they would be incorrect. The term antisocial has nothing to do with being shy. Quite frankly, the individuals that I'm going to cite that probably exhibit antisocial personality disorder are not shy at all. I've picked very polarized examples to really stress that point, that somebody exhibiting these symptoms has not even one iota of shyness necessarily. These are individuals that exhibit a lack of consciousness or a lack of moral compass, meaning individuals that are willing to do something that is morally wrong, that is lawfully wrong, even if it affects their friends and family, without any conscience. So, for example, I'm talking about someone who's willing to cheat you or steal from you and not show any remorse whatsoever. And that part there is key. Shows no remorse whatsoever. Whether that affects you financially, whether that affects you physically, whether that affects you psychologically, no regard whatsoever for the well-being of other individuals. To me, if you're familiar with the Breaking Bad universe, I think Saul Goodman does a decent job portraying some of this. An individual who's willing to cheat you or steal from you to benefit themselves in some circumstances without that moral compass. If you're familiar with the Breaking Bad universe, Saul Goodman, the picture there on the bottom left corner, is definitely not shy. So I'm really trying to emphasize this point. I know it says antisocial. Think about this more as anti-society and not antisocial in the way that you might anticipate. Another individual, and this slightly breaks one of my rules of not trying to relate this back to real people, but I think the clip in the bottom right corner, if you started at about 145, it shows you some dialogue of Charles Manson talking about some of the murders that he was either directly or indirectly responsible for. I think it's pretty clear he shows no remorse for his actions. That type of behavioral pattern of being told, how do you feel about murdering that woman? And he says, I don't care. It's not my problem. Well, that's clearly showing a lack of remorse. Some individuals who have committed murder are in the complete opposite direction and are incredibly remorseful for the rest of their life. That's absolutely not the case when you start that clip at 145. So if you watch that clip, you will see what I mean by a lack of conscience or a lack of remorse. I will note, just before transitioning, the College Board loves to include this in the multiple choice, even in some cases in the FRQ, because an educated guess is going to be wrong 100% of the time. If you talk about somebody being shy, automatically incorrect. So be wary that this has nothing to do with shyness. You could see this as an FRQ, and it might ask you, for example, you are walking down the street and you see somebody's iPhone and you recognize whose phone it is. Do you return it? Well, if you have antisocial personality disorder, you would probably keep it and sell it because you don't have any remorse for your actions, even though it might affect somebody you know. If you see a wallet on the ground, same deal. You might keep the money, not even choose to return it. If a teacher accidentally leaves the answer key out to an exam, you might take it, show no remorse. You might not even show anybody, just keep it to yourself. In none of those circumstances was shyness even remotely related. So make sure if you see this as an FRQ or a multiple choice, you do not fall victim to a very common mistake. The last one in cluster B is called borderline personality disorder. When an individual exhibits borderline personality disorder, they have a difficult time regulating their emotions, which can sometimes lead to severe, unstable mood swings and instability. Now, you read that and it might sound a little bit like bipolar disorder, but I need to make a very important distinction as to why this differs from bipolar disorder. Borderline is more affected by the environment, meaning what's happening over the course of that day. Did you receive good news? Did you receive bad news? Did you get a good grade back from one of your teachers, a bad grade back? Did you run into traffic? Did somebody in your environment make an offhand comment that insulted you? Borderline personality disorders and the shift between feeling really awesome and really upset and those mood swings and that instability surrounding those mood swings is affected by stuff that happens over the course of your day. So you could from 11 o'clock to 11:15 be in a great mood. And then at 11:15, you get bad news. Maybe your boss calls you and says you have to come into work. And then from 11:15 to noon, you're in a really bad mood. And there's a really significant and dramatic shift in your overall mood. Well, that was clearly affected by something in your environment over the course of the day. With bipolar disorder, the depression and the mania, and honestly, even that middle ground where neither is being exhibited, takes way longer. You're not going to see such a dramatic shift immediately as a byproduct of something in the environment. With borderline, you might actually see that, where twice in 1 hour, 3 times in 1 hour, there's that shift back and forth. It's much more unstable. There's a significant degree of instability with the overall mood swings. So if you take a look here, and I've just articulated this, but just to really emphasize this, when we break these down, the left column here for bipolar disorder, it really states is not really affected by life events too much, while borderline personality disorder absolutely is strongly affected by life events. And I think that's really important. Borderline personality disorder is going to be affected by good news or bad news over the course of the day, even within the course of a single hour. Bipolar disorder, not nearly as much. So transitioning all the way to cluster C, this is the furthest to the right and the furthest to the right that the concept map goes. There are only 2 that fit into cluster C. In cluster C, we're going to be talking about behavioral patterns that are categorized as being fearful, though I want to stress anxiety is not an element here. We have a whole categorization of anxiety disorders, which we talked about in an earlier essential task. The first one in cluster C is what we call avoidant personality disorder. This is when an individual exhibits extreme shyness, so that's a clear element of their behavior, due to feelings of inadequacy, which then often leads them to avoid interactions with other people. Though the important part here is the patient very much would love to interact with other people, and it has nothing to do with anxiety. That point there is so critically important. So now we actually have 4 or 5 disorders in which somebody, when asked if they want to hang out on a Friday night, may choose to stay home. Just to go through them again, we have social anxiety, anxiety when talking to strangers. We have agoraphobia, anxiety in crowded places. We have schizoid personality disorder, just no desire for human contact, no desire for friendship. But now we also have a 4th one, avoidant personality disorder, in which there's no anxiety, there is a desire to interact with other people, but there's feelings of inadequacy. There's that doubt. Will they like me? Will they value my friendship? I mean, what's the point? They already have so many friends. They don't need another friend. That feeling of inadequacy, questioning your merit, questioning your value to these other individuals, questioning whether or not they'll appreciate your interactions and your friendship, that in and of itself is what we classify as avoidant personality disorder, because it's important that this patient is not anxious when they talk to strangers. There's just that self-doubt pertaining to whether or not their friendship would be valued by these individuals. The last one is what we call dependent personality disorder, which simply put is the excessive need to be taken care of. I'm talking about someone that might be overly clingy. There are certain life decisions that at some point you need to make on your own, like, for example, what classes you should take, particularly when you get into college, where you have way more autonomy over your schedule. Class times, class levels, just classes themselves. There are decisions that at some point in time you need to make on your own. You certainly can rely on a significant other or a parent to make many life decisions, but there will eventually be a point where you need to make decisions on your own. And if there's that persistent need to be taken care of for big life decisions to be made by others around you, well, that's what we would look for with a dependent personality disorder diagnosis.